Commander Yusuf Rahimi lifted his radio, looked at the terrified soldiers kneeling in the dirt below him, and gave an order that made even his own men flinch. 1 hour, if the mountain valley was not cleared of American forces within 1 hour, he would begin executing hostages, starting with the youngest. 31 lives were now running out of time because 13 of the best snipers in the United States Army had already failed to stop him. Nobody in that command center knew it yet, but the answer to General Briggs's question was already sitting quietly in the corner, taking notes. Before we go any further, if true stories of courage against impossible odds move you, hit that subscribe button right now and stay with me until the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight, so I can see just how far this story has traveled. The radio crackled with static, and then came the voice that made every soldier in the command center go still. 1 hour, Rahimi's voice said through the interpreter, flat and cold. 1 hour or I start with the young one. General Nathan Briggs stood over the comms table with both hands pressed flat against the metal, his jaw tight enough to crack. He had been in this business for over 20 years. He had heard threats before, but something in the way this man spoke, the calm patience of it, told him this was not a bluff. Get me eyes on that valley, Briggs said. Now. A young intelligence officer named Corporal Diaz didn't look up from her screen. Sir, we have partial satellite coverage. The convoy is pinned in a natural bowl formation, surrounded on 3 sides. Rahimi's position is elevated, roughly 3,800 meters from our nearest possible firing line. 3,800, Briggs repeated. The number hung in the air like a verdict. That's not a shot. That's a fantasy. Sir, Diaz said carefully, there is no other option. Ground approach would take 6 hours minimum through that terrain, and that's if the convoy holds that long, which intelligence says is unlikely. Briggs closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. When he opened them, the exhaustion was gone, replaced by something harder. Get me every sniper we have. Within minutes, the room filled with the heavy footsteps of men who had spent their entire careers proving they belonged in rooms like this one. Master Sergeant Roy Chambers walked in first, tall, weathered, carrying the kind of quiet confidence that came from 2 decades of not missing. Behind him came 4 more, each one decorated, each one respected, each one utterly convinced that if the shot could be made, one of them would be the one to make it. Briggs looked around the room and asked the question that would echo through every version of this story for years to come. Any snipers left? Chambers stepped forward without hesitation. Sir, I'll take it. You understand the range? I heard it, sir. Say it back to me. Chambers' throat moved as he swallowed. 3,800 meters. Nobody in the room said anything, because everybody understood what that number meant. The world record for a confirmed combat kill sat somewhere near that distance, and it had taken a legend to make it, under perfect conditions, with no one's life hanging on a countdown clock. Do it, Briggs said. Chambers moved to the firing position. His spotter, a broad-shouldered man named Sergeant Alvarez, dropped into position beside him and began calling numbers into a small device, murmuring calculations under his breath. In the back corner of the room, unnoticed by nearly everyone, Captain Emily Carter sat with a notebook open on her knee. She did not look up when Chambers took his position. She did not look up when the room went quiet in anticipation. She kept writing. Wind at the muzzle, 4 miles an hour out of the northwest, Alvarez said. Confirmed, Chambers whispered. Hold your breath on my mark. Chambers' fingers settled against the trigger. His body had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that only comes from years of training the mind to override the panic screaming underneath it. Fire! The shot cracked through the room like a whip. Silence. Then Diaz's voice, tight with disappointment. Miss, low and left. Estimated 4 meters off target. Chambers' shoulders dropped for exactly 1 second before he forced them back up. Re-rack, I'll adjust. No time, Briggs snapped. Next! A younger sniper named Corporal Thomas Reyes stepped into position, sweat already beating at his temple. He had never taken a shot at this range in combat, only in training, and everyone in the room could see the difference in his hands. Wind's shifting, Alvarez called out. 6 miles an hour now, changing direction. Just tell me when, Reyes said, his voice cracking slightly. Hold, fire. The shot rang out. Miss, Diaz said. The wind moved mid-flight. It's not behaving like standard terrain. Reyes stepped back from the rifle, breathing hard. Sir, something's wrong with this valley. The wind isn't doing what it should. Explain, Briggs demanded. I don't know how to explain it, sir. It's like the mountain is breathing. Nobody laughed. Nobody had time to. The third sniper, a stone-faced veteran named Sergeant Okafor, took the position without a word. Yeah, he had 31 confirmed kills and a reputation for never speaking unless it was necessary. Talk to me, Briggs said. I don't need to talk, sir. I need to shoot. Alvarez called the numbers. Okafor adjusted, breathed, and fired. For a moment, nobody spoke. Diaz stared at her screen, her mouth slightly open. That was close, she finally said. Centimeters. He clipped the rock face beside the target. Rahimi didn't even flinch. Okafor's hand tightened around the rifle stock until his knuckles went white. He said nothing, but the muscle in his jaw was working overtime. In the corner, Emily's pen moved faster now. She had noticed something in the pattern of the 3 misses that none of the men at the firing line had time to see, because they were too busy trying to survive the next 60 seconds. The 4th sniper failed. The 5th sniper failed. By the 6th attempt, the room had changed. The confidence that had filled it an hour earlier had drained out, replaced by something closer to dread. Soldiers who had never doubted themselves in their lives were beginning to doubt the mountain, the mission, and eventually, quietly, themselves. Sir, Chambers said, stepping toward Briggs, with respect, I don't think conventional windage math is going to solve this. That valley is doing something we've never trained for. Then what do you suggest, Sergeant? Because Briggs glanced at the clock on the wall. 41 minutes, that man starts killing hostages. Chambers had no answer. For the first time in his career, he had no answer. The radio crackled again, and this time the voice on the other end was not Rahimi's. It was American, breathless, panicked. Command, this is convoy lead. We are taking fire. I say again, we are taking fire. We have 1 wounded requesting immediate. The transmission cut into static. Briggs's hand slammed against the table. Get that channel back. Working on it, sir. Diaz's fingers flew across her keyboard, and for 10 agonizing seconds, the room held its breath. Command, this is convoy lead. We're still here. Wounded soldier is stable, but sir, we cannot hold this position much longer. A collective exhale swept through the room, but it did not bring relief. It brought urgency, sharper and more desperate than before. 7th attempt, Briggs said, his voice raw. Who's next? A pause. Nobody stepped forward immediately, and in that pause, something shifted in the room. Something that felt almost like shame. 5 of the best snipers in the country stood along the wall, and not one of them moved. Finally, a broad-shouldered soldier named Sergeant Whitfield stepped up, his face pale but determined. I'll try, sir. He failed. The 8th sniper failed. The 9th sniper's round struck so close to the target that for 1 electric second, the entire room believed it had worked before Diaz's voice cut through the celebration. Negative, negative, target is still moving. I say again, target is confirmed alive. Groans of disbelief rippled through the men. By the 10th failure, Chambers had returned to the firing line himself, refusing to accept that his earlier miss would be his last attempt. This time he adjusted everything, recalculated with Alvarez for nearly 3 full minutes, accounting for every variable they could think of. Fire, Alvarez finally said. The shot cracked. Silence stretched. Miss, Diaz whispered. I'm sorry, Sergeant. It curved again. The wind did something at the halfway point that none of our instruments predicted. Chambers stepped back from the rifle and, for the first time in the entire operation, pressed both hands over his face. This isn't possible, he said quietly. This shot isn't possible. Briggs looked at the clock. 28 minutes remained. The 11th attempt failed. The 12th attempt failed, and this time the miss was so far off that Diaz didn't even bother reading out the distance. She simply shook her head. By the 13th attempt, something had broken in the room. The best marksmen the United States Army had to offer stood along the wall in silence, staring at their hands, at the rifle, at the floor, at anything that wasn't the general's face. Briggs turned in a slow circle, taking in every soldier standing there. Any snipers left? He asked again, quieter this time, almost to himself. Nobody answered. The silence stretched long enough that it became its own kind of sound, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on every person in that room. And then, from the back corner, a chair scraped softly against the floor. Every head turned. Captain Emily Carter stood up. For a moment, nobody recognized her, because for the entire operation, nobody had truly looked at her. She had been in the room the whole time, sitting quietly with her notebook, and somehow she had become invisible in a space full of people trained to notice everything. "Who is that?" Whitfield murmured to the soldier beside him. "Administrative," the soldier muttered back. "I think she does logistics." Emily heard it. She had heard versions of that sentence for most of her career. She did not flinch. She had joined the Army at 22 with a mind built for numbers and patterns, the kind of mind that saw the invisible architecture underneath chaotic systems. In training, instructors had praised her calculations while quietly assuming she would never need to use them in the field. In her first posting, a commanding officer had looked at her scores, the highest in her class, and then handed her a desk job anyway because, in his words, real shooters had a certain look to them, and she didn't have it. She had spent years proving herself in small ways that nobody remembered, filling notebook after notebook with calculations on wind behavior, thermal drift, and long-range ballistics that most of her superiors never asked to see. She studied not because someone told her to, but because she could not stop herself from understanding a problem once it had taken root in her mind. And this mountain, this valley, had taken root the moment she walked into the room 3 hours earlier. "Captain," Briggs said slowly, "this is not the time." "General," Emily said, her voice steady despite the pressure of every eye in the room, "I think I understand what's happening in that valley." A short, disbelieving laugh came from somewhere near the wall. Okafor, still rattled from his own miss, didn't bother hiding his skepticism. "With respect, Captain, 13 of the best shooters in this army just failed. What exactly do you think you understand that we don't?" Emily didn't back down. "I understand that none of you were wrong about your math. I understand that the wind isn't random, it's cyclical." "Cyclical," Okafor repeated flatly. "The valley creates a thermal pattern," Emily continued, stepping forward, notebook still clutched in her hand. "Cold air pools at the base during the early morning, then rises as the surrounding rock heats unevenly. That rising air interacts with the ridgeline above the target, creating layers that shift on a delay, not randomly, but in a cycle that repeats roughly every 90 seconds. Chambers stared at her. "You've been sitting there for 3 hours doing what exactly?" "Watching your misses," Emily said. "Every failed shot told me something. The first 3 rounds drifted low. That's consistent with a thermal updraft near the base of the valley. The next several drifted in inconsistent directions, which told me the mid-layer winds were interacting with something above them. Something none of your spotters were tracking because it's above standard measurement height." Alvarez, who had spent the last hour humiliated by his own calculations failing again and again, leaned forward. "You're saying there's a wind layer we're not accounting for?" "I'm saying there's a wind layer nobody has ever had a reason to account for," Emily said, "because nobody has ever needed to shoot this far, through this terrain, under this kind of time pressure." Briggs's eyes narrowed. "And you think you can hit a moving pattern that's changing every 90 seconds? "I don't think I can hit it whenever I want, General." Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "I think there's a window, a few seconds where every layer aligns. If I can time it, the shot becomes possible." The room had gone utterly silent, the kind of silence that comes when people who are trained to trust hard evidence are being asked to trust something they cannot yet see. Whitfield shook his head slowly. "Sir, this is insane. We have 20 minutes left, and she wants to test some kind of theory she came up with sitting in a chair." "I didn't come up with it sitting in a chair today," Emily said, her voice sharpening for the first time. "I've been studying wind behavior in mountain terrain for 11 years. Every notebook I filled, every report nobody read, every calculation my commanding officers filed away without looking at, it all led to this valley. I have never asked this room for anything. I am asking now." Chambers looked at Briggs. Briggs looked at the clock. 19 minutes. "Show me," Briggs said. Emily opened her notebook and spread 3 pages across the table, pages filled with dense calculations, wind charts, and a diagram of the valley that she had sketched from memory over the last hour, marking small numbered points along the ridgeline. Alvarez leaned over the pages, his skepticism slowly giving way to something else. "This is," he trailed off, running a finger down one column of numbers. "This actually tracks with the miss pattern, every single one." Okafor moved closer, arms still crossed, but his eyes had lost some of their hostility. You predicted our misses before they happened. I predicted where the wind was going to hit them, Emily said. Not because I'm smarter than any of you, because I had the luxury of watching instead of shooting. Daniel Pollard, the most decorated marksman in the room, a man who had said almost nothing during the entire operation, finally stepped forward. He had watched every failed attempt with the quiet calculation of someone who had seen more combat than anyone else present. He studied Emily's diagram for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. "Where's the window?" he finally asked. Emily pointed to a section of her notes. "Based on the pattern, the next alignment should occur in approximately 4 minutes. It will last somewhere between 3 and 6 seconds. Pollard looked up at her, something shifting behind his eyes. "You're telling me you can call a 6-second window in a mountain valley from a chair in the back of this room?" "I'm telling you, I've been tracking that window since the third failed shot," Emily said, "and it's held true every single time since." The room seemed to hold its breath collectively. Briggs's radio crackled again. "Command, this is convoy lead. Hostage situation is escalating. I say again, hostiles are moving the youngest captive into open position. They are preparing." The transmission cut, and this time nobody breathed until it came back. "Command, do you copy? They are preparing for execution. We need that shot now." Briggs turned back to the room. 15 minutes remained. He looked at his 5 best snipers, exhausted, shaken, staring at the floor. He looked at Emily Carter, standing straight, notebook in hand, the only person in the room who had not once flinched. "Captain Carter," he said slowly. "Sir, can you make this shot?" The question hung in the air, heavier than any of the 13 failed rounds that had come before it. Emily did not answer immediately. She looked at the notebook in her hands, at the calculations that had consumed 11 years of quiet, overlooked work, at the men around her who had spent the last hour discovering the limits of everything they thought they knew. "I can give you the best attempt anyone has made today," she said finally. It wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't false confidence. It was the truth, offered plainly, by the one person in that room who had spent her entire career learning the difference between the two. Pollard studied her for one long moment, then turned to Briggs. "General," he said, "she's the only one in this room who's been right about anything for the last hour." Briggs looked at the clock. 14 minutes. 31 lives. One shot that no one believed was possible, waiting for the one person nobody had thought to ask. 14 minutes remained on the clock, and General Briggs did not waste a single second of them. "Move to the line," he said to Emily. "Now." Emily closed her notebook and tucked it under her arm as she crossed the room. Every eye followed her, and for the first time in her career, she did not feel invisible. She felt exposed the way a person feels standing on a stage they never auditioned for. But she kept her spine straight and her steps even, because the men watching her needed to see someone who believed she could do this, even if inside her chest, her heart was slamming against her ribs like a fist against a locked door. Chambers stepped into her path before she reached the rifle. He was not blocking her. He was studying her, the way a soldier studies a bridge he is about to cross, testing its weight before trusting it with his life. "You understand what happens if you miss," he said quietly, not unkindly. "I understand what happens if nobody tries," Emily answered. Chambers held her gaze a moment longer, then stepped aside. "Then don't miss, Captain." Pollard was already at the rifle, running his hands along the barrel with the careful respect of a man greeting an old friend. He looked up as Emily approached. "This is my rifle," he said. "Custom build. Nobody touches it but me." "I need a .338 with a heavier barrel profile," Emily said without hesitation. "Standard issue won't hold 0 long enough for what I'm about to ask it to do." Pollard's eyebrows lifted slightly, the first flicker of genuine surprise crossing his face since the mission began. "You know weapons systems." "I know what this shot requires," Emily said. "I've known for 3 hours." He studied her for one more second, then stepped back from the rifle and gestured to it with an open hand. "Then it's yours." Emily settled into position, and immediately something felt wrong. The stock sat too high against her cheek, built for a taller shooter, and her first instinct was to adjust the entire platform, but there was no time to rebuild a rifle from scratch. "Cheek riser," she said. "I need 2 inches of lift immediately." Alvarez was already moving, digging through a support case, pulling out a folded strap of padding used for exactly this kind of emergency adjustment. He wrapped it around the stock with quick, practiced hands, cinching it tight. "Test it," he said. Emily settled back down, and this time her eye lined naturally with the scope. "Better." 12 minutes, Diaz called out from across the room, her voice tighter now, the countdown pressing on everyone like a physical weight. Briggs crouched beside the firing position, his voice low. "Captain, talk me through this. I need to understand what I'm authorizing before that hostage's life depends on it." Emily kept her eyes on the scope, adjusting the elevation turret with small, precise clicks. "The valley behaves like a lung, General. Cold air pools at the bottom during the early hours, and as the sun heats the exposed rock face on the eastern ridge, that air begins to rise. But it doesn't rise evenly. It rises in pulses, because the terrain isn't uniform. There are 3 distinct thermal layers between this position and the target, and each one moves independently." "That's what every sniper in this room already knew," Okafor said from behind her, arms crossed. His tone edged with the frustration of a man who had failed 3 separate times and did not appreciate being lectured by someone who had failed 0. "They knew the layers existed," Emily said, still not turning around. "What they didn't know is that the layers interact with each other on a delay. When the lowest layer shifts, it takes approximately 11 seconds for that shift to influence the middle layer, and another 9 for it to reach the upper layer near the target. That delay creates a window. For roughly 4 to 6 seconds, all 3 layers align in the same direction at the same speed, and during that window, the bullet's flight path becomes almost as predictable as it would be on a calm day." Pollard, standing at her shoulder now as her spotter, nodded slowly. "That's why every shot before yours missed in a different direction. Nobody was accounting for the delay." "Exactly," Emily said. 11 minutes, Diaz called, and this time her voice cracked slightly on the number. The radio crackled to life again, and every head in the room turned toward it with the same instinctive dread. "Command, this is Convoy Lead. Be advised, hostiles have moved the youngest hostage into open ground. Repeat, hostage is now in open ground. They are staging for execution. We need eyes, and we need them now." Briggs's hand tightened into a fist against his thigh. "How long?" The radio crackled with static before the voice returned, thinner this time, strained under the weight of what the soldier on the other end was watching happen in front of him. "Unknown, sir. Could be minutes, could be less." The room went silent in a way that felt different from before. Heavier, the kind of silence that presses against the inside of a person's chest. Emily's hands did not shake. She would think about that later, in the years that followed, how strange it was that in the single most important moment of her career, her hands had been perfectly steady, while everything else inside her screamed. 10 minutes, Diaz said. "Talk to me about the window," Briggs said, crouching lower beside Emily. "When does it open again?" Emily glanced at the small chronometer strapped to her wrist, and then back at her notebook, flipping to a page covered in tick marks she had recorded over the last 3 hours, timestamps corresponding to every failed shot in the wind behavior that followed it. Based on the last 13 cycles, the pattern repeats approximately every 92 seconds, she said. "We should have a window opening in roughly 40 seconds, but I don't want to take that one." Whitfield, still nursing the sting of his own failed attempt, made a sound of disbelief. "You don't want to take the first window? We have 10 minutes left and you want to skip a chance?" "The first window after a long observation period is less reliable," Emily said, her voice level despite the pressure building around her. "I need to confirm the cycle is holding steady before I commit to a shot I only get to take once. If I fire on unconfirmed data and I'm wrong, we lose the element of surprise, Rahimi's men reposition, and every future shot becomes exponentially harder." "So you're saying we wait," Briggs said. "I'm saying I need one more confirmed cycle before I fire," Emily said. "That's 92 seconds, plus the shot itself. We can afford that. We cannot afford a miss." Briggs looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that measured not her calculations but her nerve. And whatever he saw in her face was apparently enough, because he stood and turned to the room. "Everybody quiet. Let her work." The room obeyed, and in the sudden hush, Emily felt the full weight of every person's hope pressing down on her shoulders like a physical hand. Pollard leaned close, his voice barely above a whisper. "Talk me through what you're watching for. I want to help you track it." "Watch the tree line on the lower ridge," Emily said, pointing to a live feed displayed on a monitor beside them, the grainy image trembling slightly with the wind. When the branches on the left side begin moving before the branches on the right, that's the first layer shifting. Count from that moment. Pollard fixed his eyes on the screen, and for the first time since the operation began, the most decorated marksman in the room deferred completely to someone else's judgment. There, he said suddenly. Left side moving. Starting the count, Emily said, her eyes never leaving the scope. 9 minutes. The seconds stretched unbearably as Emily counted under her breath, her lips barely moving, her focus narrowing until the entire room seemed to disappear around her, until there was nothing left in the world except the mountain, the wind, and the numbers ticking silently behind her eyes. 11, she whispered. Middle layer should be shifting now. On the monitor, a faint ripple moved across the mid-elevation grass, exactly as she predicted. A few soldiers along the wall exchanged glances. Okafor's arms slowly uncrossed. 9 more seconds until upper layer alignment, Emily said. Pollard's breath caught slightly. She's tracking it in real time. The upper layer shifted precisely when Emily said it would, and for one suspended moment, the entire room understood that they were watching something extraordinary happen. Not luck, not instinct, but pure, disciplined observation finally paying off after 11 years of being ignored. Cycle confirmed, Emily said, and for the first time since she'd stood up from her chair, there was the faintest tremor of relief in her voice. The pattern is holding. 8 minutes, Diaz called. Next window in approximately 90 seconds, Emily said. That's the one I'll take. Briggs's jaw tightened. That leaves us almost no margin. I know, Emily said quietly, but I'd rather take 1 shot with real data than 3 shots with none. You've already watched what happens otherwise. Nobody in the room argued with that. The radio crackled again, and this time Convoy Lead's voice came through ragged, desperate. Command, be advised. Hostiles are positioning the hostage against the rock face. This looks like final staging. I say again, final staging. If you have a shot, take it. Take it now. Briggs's eyes flicked to Emily. Captain, 90 seconds isn't negotiable, General, Emily said, her voice steady even as her pulse hammered so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. If I fire outside the window, the round drifts, Rahimi survives, and that hostage dies for nothing. I need those 90 seconds. Briggs keyed the radio, his voice carrying an authority that even Rahimi's threats hadn't shaken from him. Convoy Lead, hold position, do not engage. Sniper is preparing final shot, 90 seconds. Copy, command, but sir, I don't think we have 90 seconds. The line went quiet, and in that quiet, something in Briggs's face changed, the mask of command slipping just enough to reveal the human being underneath it. A man who had sent soldiers into danger for 2 decades and had never once gotten used to the weight of it. 7 minutes, Diaz said, her voice barely audible now. Emily forced her breathing to slow, forced the panic clawing at the edges of her mind back into the small, disciplined box she had built for it over 11 years of training. She had learned long ago that fear was not the enemy of precision. Distraction was, and she would not allow herself to be distracted. Not now, not when 31 lives were balanced on the edge of a 6-second window. 60 seconds to window, Pollard said, his eyes locked on the monitor. Confirm wind at the muzzle, Emily said. Alvarez, who had been silently recalibrating instruments beside her this entire time, called out the reading. 3 miles an hour, steady, out of the northwest. That matches the beginning of the last 2 cycles, Emily murmured. Good. 45 seconds, Pollard said. Chambers, standing near the wall, found himself leaning forward without realizing it. The same instinct that had driven him to volunteer first now driving him to will this stranger's shot into existence, because somewhere in the last 10 minutes, without ever discussing it out loud, every failed sniper in that room had quietly begun rooting for her to succeed where they had not. 30 seconds, Pollard said. Emily's finger rested lightly against the trigger guard, not yet on the trigger itself, her body settling into the same profound stillness that Chambers had shown at the very beginning of the operation, except this time it did not feel like performance. It felt like certainty. And then the radio erupted. Command! Command! They're moving. They're removing the hostage, I say again. They have moved him to a new position, elevated, closer to the commander. This changes the shot angle. Does your sniper copy? Does she copy? Emily's entire body went cold. Say again, Briggs barked into the radio. Say the position again. He's been moved 11 meters east and elevated approximately 2 meters. They've put him directly beside Rahimi, sir. I think they're using him as a shield now. This is not the position she calculated for. The room seemed to tilt. Every calculation Emily had built over the last 3 hours, every timestamp, every observed cycle, had been based on a fixed target position. Now the position had shifted. And worse, the hostage had been moved directly into the blast radius of any margin for error. 15 seconds to window, Pollard said, his voice tight with the sudden, brutal understanding of what this meant. Captain, Briggs said, his voice sharp with urgency. Can you adjust? Emily's mind raced, recalculating the angle in real time, factoring in the new elevation, the new lateral distance, the terrifying proximity of an innocent life to the only acceptable margin of error she had. Sweat beaded at her hairline despite the cool air in the room. I need 3 seconds, she said. You don't have 3 seconds, Alvarez said, his eyes locked on the readout. Window opens in 10. Then I'll take 3 of the window seconds to adjust, Emily said, her voice hardening into something that silenced every doubt still lingering in the room. Everybody, quiet, now. The room obeyed instantly. Emily's hands moved with a speed and precision that made Pollard's breath catch. Small adjustments to the scope's elevation, a fractional shift in her own body position. Her mind running the new numbers faster than any calculator in the room could have managed. 5 seconds, Pollard whispered. New angle locked, Emily said, her voice barely audible. 4. Her finger settled onto the trigger. 3. The wind on the monitor rippled exactly as she had predicted, the lower layer shifting first. 2. The middle layer moved. 1. Emily exhaled, slow and controlled, her entire body going utterly still, the way it had 1,000 times before in training, in solitude, in rooms nobody had ever cared to watch her practice in. Window open, Pollard breathed, and in that instant, before Emily's finger could complete its final fractional movement, the radio screamed to life one more time. Convoy lead's voice raw with terror. Command, he's raising his weapon. He's raising it right now. If you're going to take the shot, take it, take it, take. The transmission cut into static. Every soldier in the room froze. Briggs's hand hovered over the radio, unable to speak, unable to breathe. Chambers' fist clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Okafor had stopped breathing entirely. Emily heard none of it. In the 6 seconds that belonged only to her, the room had ceased to exist. There was no general, no radio, no countdown clock ticking toward 0. There was only the mountain, the wind moving exactly where she had known it would move, and 31 lives balanced on a decision that 11 years of overlooked notebooks had prepared her to make. Her finger began its final pull. 6 minutes, Diaz whispered, though nobody was listening to the clock anymore. Pollard's voice dropped to barely a breath. Fire when ready, Captain. Emily's world narrowed to a single point of light at the very edge of the scope, the faintest silhouette of a man who held 31 lives in his hands, standing exactly where her calculations said he would stand, in exactly the window her 11 years had promised her would open. The trigger began to move, and then from somewhere behind her, Whitfield's voice broke the silence in a hoarse, desperate whisper that nobody in that room would ever forget. Wait, something's wrong with the feed. The target's moving. He's not where the calculation says he should be, Captain. Do you copy? The target is moving. Emily's whole body locked, the trigger frozen at the exact edge of release, half a pound of pressure away from a shot that would either save 31 lives or end in a way none of them would ever recover from. Say that again, Briggs snapped, but this time his voice came out as barely more than a rasp, because some part of him already understood what a mistimed word could cost. Whitfield stared at the monitor, his hand trembling as he pointed. The feed, sir. Look at the feed. The target's silhouette shifted. He's not standing where he was 3 seconds ago. Pollard's eyes flicked to the screen and then back to Emily, his jaw tight. Captain? Emily did not answer immediately. Her eyes stayed pressed to the scope, her breathing shallow and controlled, every instinct in her body screaming to either fire now or abort. And somewhere underneath that screaming, the quiet, disciplined part of her mind that had filled 11 years of notebooks was already working the problem. It's not the target that moved, she said, her voice low, almost a whisper, but carrying enough authority that the entire room seemed to lean toward her to catch it. It's the wind. What? Chambers said. The upper layer is bending the image, Emily said, still not moving, still not lifting her eye from the scope. Heat shimmer off the ridge face. At this range, atmospheric distortion can make a stationary target appear to shift position on camera, even when it hasn't moved at all. Whitfield, what's the feed's zoom level? Whitfield's hands flew across the console. 40 times magnification. At 40 times, thermal distortion reads as motion, Emily said. He hasn't moved. The air moved. Silence swallowed the room whole. Alvarez stared at his own readout, comparing it against the monitor, his face slowly draining of color as he realized she was right. She's correct. The secondary sensor confirms it. The target's actual coordinates haven't changed in the last 4 seconds. It's a visual artifact. Whitfield exhaled like a man who had just stepped back from the edge of a cliff. I'm sorry, Captain. I thought I saw. You did the right thing telling me, Emily said. And there was no anger in her voice, only the calm of someone who had spent a career being doubted and had long ago stopped needing to punish people for it. I'd rather you speak up wrong than stay silent, right? Now let me finish. Briggs's hand hovered over the radio, his knuckles pale. Captain, window status. 4 seconds remaining, Pollard said, his voice tight. Emily's finger found its place on the trigger again, the fractional pressure building the way it had before the interruption, her mind resetting itself back into the narrow tunnel of pure calculation that had carried her through the last 90 seconds. 3 seconds, Pollard whispered. The image in the scope steadied. The false shimmer settling, the true outline of a man standing exactly where Emily's mathematics had said he would stand, exactly where an innocent life stood pressed beside him, closer than any margin of error should ever have to tolerate. 2 seconds. Somewhere behind her, she heard Briggs' breath catch, heard the low murmur of Chambers muttering something under his breath that might have been a prayer, though the man would later deny it had been anything of the sort. 1 second. Emily's whole world reduced itself to the crosshair, to the wind, to the mountain that had spent 3 hours teaching her its secrets, one failed shot at a time. And in that final second, something inside her went utterly quiet, the way it always did in the instant before the truth revealed itself. The trigger broke. The rifle's report cracked through the room like a peal of thunder, and the sound seemed to hang in the air far longer than physics should have allowed, as if the entire building had gone still just to hold it. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Diaz's hands hovered over her keyboard, frozen mid-motion. Chambers had both fists clenched against his chest without realizing he'd raised them there. Okafor's mouth had fallen open. The skepticism from an hour earlier wiped completely from his face, replaced by something closer to awe or maybe dread. Because in this business, the line between the two was thinner than anyone liked to admit. The bullet was already gone, already crossing a distance that no one in that room had ever seen around travel in real combat, cutting through layer after layer of shifting mountain air, through the exact window Emily had spent 3 hours learning to predict, carrying with it 11 years of overlooked notebooks, 11 years of quiet rooms nobody had bothered to walk into, 11 years of a woman proving something to herself long before she ever got the chance to prove it to anyone else. For nearly 3 full seconds, the bullet remained in flight. 3 seconds does not sound like a long time, but in that command center with 31 lives and a radio gone silent and a general who had aged a decade in the last quarter hour, 3 seconds stretched into something that felt endless, something that pressed against every chest in the room like a hand refusing to let go. Pollard's eyes never left the monitor. His lips moved, counting silently, tracking the flight time with the precision of a man who had spent his entire career learning exactly how long it took a bullet to cross an impossible distance. 0.6, he murmured. 0.7. Alvarez's hand trembled over his instrument panel, watching the wind reading scroll past, praying silently that the pattern held, that the cycle Emily had trusted with everything did not choose this exact moment, this exact 3 seconds, to break the promise it had kept for the last 90. Briggs stood frozen at the edge of the firing line, his eyes fixed not on the monitor, but on Emily's face, searching for some sign, some flicker of doubt or certainty that might tell him what was coming before the feed did. There was none. Emily's face had gone completely still, the stillness of someone who had already done everything within her power and now had nothing left to do but wait alongside everyone else, a stillness that unsettled Briggs more than any panic could have, because it told him she had already accepted whatever the next 3 seconds would bring. The radio remained silent. "Command, come in," Briggs said into the receiver, his voice barely audible. "Convoy lead, do you copy?" Static. Diaz's fingers flew across her console. Signal's weak. Here, I'm trying to boost it. Pollard's counting continued, his voice dropping lower with each fraction of a second. 1.1, 1.2. Chambers had stopped, breathing entirely. His eyes locked on the monitor, watching for the smallest flicker of movement that would tell him whether 11 years of quiet preparation was about to save a convoy of 31 people or become the most devastating failure any of them had ever witnessed. Whitfield, still shaken from his own false alarm moments earlier, pressed both hands against the edge of the console, his knuckles white, his lips moving in something that looked almost like an apology to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. 1.6, Pollard whispered. 1.7. The bullet, invisible now to every eye in that room, except the trajectory calculations running silently behind Emily's steady gaze, continued its impossible journey across a distance that 13 of the best marksmen in the United States Army had already declared unconquerable. 2 seconds, Pollard said, and his voice cracked on the number. Briggs's hand tightened around the radio until the plastic groaned in his grip. Convoy lead, do you copy? This is command. Convoy lead, respond. Static and then faint, broken, barely audible over the crackle of a dying signal. A voice returned. Command, this is... The transmission dissolved into noise. Say again, Briggs barked, his composure finally cracking, under the weight of everything the last 3 hours had asked of him. Say again, convoy lead. Do you copy? 2.4 seconds, Pollard whispered, and something in his voice had changed, something that made every head in the room turn toward him. What? Chambers said. What is it? Pollard did not answer. His eyes were locked on the monitor, watching something none of the rest of them could yet see. His mouth slightly open, his entire body gone rigid. The radio crackled once more, and this time the voice broke through clearly enough to understand, though the words themselves seemed to hang suspended in the air, too enormous for the room to fully absorb all at once. Command, this is convoy lead. Be advised. The transmission cut again. Diaz slammed her palm against the console. Signals degrading. I need 30 seconds to rear sheet through the secondary relay. We don't have 30 seconds, Briggs said, his voice raw. We don't have anything left to give. Emily had not moved from the firing position. She remained exactly as she had been the instant the shot left the barrel, her eyes still against the scope, her breathing slow and even, watching the last fragments of trajectory data scroll across the small display mounted beside the rifle, numbers that meant nothing to anyone else in the room, but everything to her. 2.8 seconds, Pollard said, his voice now barely a whisper. And then on the monitor, something happened. A ripple, a shift, a single frame of grainy footage that showed a shape near the target coordinates moving in a way that made Whitfield's breath catch audibly, that made Okafor take an involuntary step forward, that made Chambers' hands unclench for the first time in nearly a minute. What am I looking at? Briggs demanded, his eyes darting between the screen and Emily's unmoving silhouette at the rifle. Somebody tell me what I'm looking at. Nobody answered because nobody yet knew, because the feed had frozen for one impossible, agonizing half-second on an image that could have meant anything, could have meant the mission's greatest triumph or its most devastating collapse. And in that frozen half-second, every soldier in that room found themselves holding a breath they didn't remember taking, waiting for a truth that 3 hours, 13 failed shots, and one impossible woman with a notebook had all led them to. The frozen frame held for exactly one more heartbeat before the feed corrected itself, and when it did, Pollard's voice broke through the silence like a dam giving way. Impact, he said. Impact, impact, target is down. For one full second, nobody in the room reacted because the words seemed too large to fit inside the space they'd just been spoken into. Then Diaz's hands flew to her mouth. Chambers' knees actually buckled slightly before he caught himself against the wall. Whitfield let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a soot. And Okafor, the same man who had questioned Emily's credentials less than 15 minutes earlier, dropped his head back and exhaled a breath that seemed to carry the weight of every failed shot he'd taken that day. Confirm, Briggs said, his voice sharp, refusing to believe it until the words came from someone whose job it was to be certain. Diaz, confirm target status. Diaz's fingers moved across her console with shaking urgency, pulling the feed steady, zooming, cross-referencing. For 3 agonizing seconds, The only sound in the room was the soft click of her keyboard and the ragged breathing of a dozen soldiers who had aged years in the last quarter hour. "Confirmed," Diaz finally said, her voice cracking on the word. "Target Rahimi is down, no movement. Secondary thermal reads no vital signs. He's gone, sir, he's gone." The room erupted, but it wasn't the kind of eruption anyone could have predicted an hour earlier. There were no fists pumped in triumph, no cheers of victory. Instead, grown men who had spent their careers mastering the art of not feeling anything in moments like this stood frozen, some with hands pressed over their mouths, some with eyes suddenly wet, all of them staring at Emily Carter as if seeing her for the very first time. The radio crackled back to life, the signal finally stabilizing, and Convoy Lead's voice came through, clear and shaking with disbelief. "Command, this is Convoy Lead. Target is down. I say again, hostile commander is confirmed down. Hostiles are breaking formation. They're retreating. The hostage is safe. I say again, the hostage is safe." Briggs closed his eyes. For a man who had spent 20 years learning to compartmentalize the weight of every decision he made, the sound of that transmission seemed to unlock something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the operation began. His shoulders dropped. His hand, still gripping the radio, finally loosened. "All hostages," he said into the receiver, his voice unsteady in a way none of the soldiers in that room had ever heard before. "Confirm all hostages." A pause that felt like an eternity. "Command, this is Convoy Lead. We have a visual on all 31. Repeat, all 31 are accounted for and alive. We have wounded, but no fatalities. I say again, no fatalities." Something broke loose in the room then, a wave of sound that swept through every soldier standing there. Half laughter, half disbelief. The sound of people who had spent the last hour watching the impossible fail again and again, suddenly forced to reckon with the fact that it hadn't failed after all. Emily remained at the rifle for a moment longer than anyone else moved, her hands still resting lightly against the stock, her breathing only now beginning to catch up with what her body had just done. She had trained for this moment for 11 years. She had imagined it 1,000 times in the quiet of empty ranges and late nights bent over notebooks nobody asked to see. But nothing had prepared her for what it actually felt like when the weight finally lifted, when 11 years of being overlooked collapsed all at once into a single undeniable truth playing out on a screen in front of 24 witnesses. Her hands began to shake, not before, not during, only now after, when it no longer mattered, when the mission was already won and there was nothing left to steady herself for. Pollard noticed. He always noticed things like that, the small human cracks that appeared after the armor came off. And instead of saying anything, he simply reached out and rested a hand briefly on her shoulder, the kind of gesture that needed no words attached to it. "You did it," he said quietly, just for her. "You actually did it." Emily let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 3 hours. "The window held," she said, her voice unsteady. "I got lucky, the pattern didn't break." "That wasn't luck," Pollard said, shaking his head slowly. "I've been doing this for 19 years, Captain. I know what luck looks like. Luck doesn't predict a wind cycle down to the second. Luck doesn't catch a false movement on a monitor and explain thermal distortion in real time while a hostage's life hangs on the next 90 seconds. What you just did wasn't luck. It was the most disciplined piece of shooting I have ever witnessed in my career." Chambers approached next, and there was something different in the way he carried himself now. None of the careful skepticism from earlier, none of the quiet condescension that had colored the room when Emily first stood up from her corner. He extended his hand. "I owe you an apology, Captain," he said. "When you stood up, I'll be honest, I didn't think you had any business being at that rifle. I was wrong about a lot of things today." Emily shook his hand, her grip steadier now, the tremor slowly working its way out of her fingers. "You weren't wrong to doubt me," she said. "Nobody in this room had ever seen me shoot. Doubt is reasonable when there's no evidence yet. I just happened to have the evidence in my notebook instead of on a scoreboard." Chambers actually laughed, a short surprise sound. 11 years of notebooks nobody read. 11 years of notebooks nobody asked to read, Emily corrected gently. And something in the way she said it, without bitterness, without accusation, simply as a fact she had made peace with long ago, seemed to land on every soldier in the room at once. Briggs had finished his transmission with Convoy Lead and turned back toward the firing line, and the entire room seemed to straighten instinctively at his presence. Old habits reasserting themselves even in the middle of a moment that had shattered every expectation anyone walked in with. He crossed the room slowly, his eyes fixed on Emily the entire way, and when he finally reached her, he didn't say anything for a long moment. He simply looked at her, the way a man looks at something he's trying to understand for the first time. "Captain Carter," he said finally. "General, how long have you been assigned to this unit?" 14 months, sir. "And in 14 months, how many times have you been asked to consult on a long-range operation?" Emily hesitated, and the hesitation itself answered the question before she spoke. "This is the first, sir." Briggs's jaw tightened, not in anger at her, but at something else entirely, something that seemed to be turning over behind his eyes as he absorbed the full weight of what that answer meant. 14 months, he repeated quietly, almost to himself. Then he extended his hand. "Outstanding work, Captain. That's the finest piece of marksmanship I've witnessed in my entire career, and I've been doing this since before you were commissioned." The word landed differently than any word had landed in that room all day. It was simple, it was short, but coming from a man who had just watched 13 of his best snipers fail one after another, coming from a man who did not hand out praise the way some officers did, cheaply and often, it meant something that Emily would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Thank you, sir," she said, and her voice, for the first time since she'd stood up from that chair 3 hours earlier, finally cracked with the emotion she'd been holding back the entire time. The room began to move again after that, the frozen tension of the last 15 minutes finally breaking apart into the ordinary business of an operation winding down. Diaz was already coordinating medevac support for the wounded convoy soldier. Alvarez had moved to secure Pollard's rifle, treating it now with an almost reverent care, as though it had become something more than equipment in the last quarter hour. Whitfield sat down heavily in a chair near the wall, running both hands through his hair, still processing the fact that he had spent the last hour watching a woman he'd dismissed as administrative solve a problem that had defeated every trained marksman in the building. But not everyone in the room had let go of their skepticism so easily. Okafor approached Emily last, and there was something guarded still in his posture, something that hadn't quite caught up to the relief everyone else in the room was feeling. "Captain," he said, "I want to understand something. You said you had been tracking wind patterns in mountain terrain for 11 years. Why has nobody heard about this before today? If your methods work this well, why weren't you already teaching this to the rest of us?" It was a fair question, and Emily didn't flinch from it. "Because nobody ever asked to see it," she said simply. "I submitted 3 research papers on thermal layer interaction in mountainous terrain during my first 6 years of service. All 3 were filed without review. My last commanding officer told me, in his exact words, that theoretical ballistics work belonged in a classroom, not in the field, and that my time would be better spent on administrative duties where my, quote, attention to detail could be put to better use." A silence settled over the small group still standing near the firing line. "That's not an answer that makes me feel good about this army," Chambers said quietly. "It's not supposed to," Emily said. "It's just the truth." Briggs, who had been listening from a few feet away, stepped back into the conversation, his expression darkening. "Captain, I want copies of every one of those research papers on my desk by tomorrow morning." "Yes, sir. And I want to know the name of the commanding officer who filed them without review." Emily hesitated for the briefest moment. "Sir, with respect, I don't think punishing one officer solves the actual problem. The problem isn't one man's judgment. It's how many people like me get filed away the same way those papers did, before anyone finds out what they're capable of." Briggs studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, the sharp edge of anger softening into something closer to respect. "You're not just a sniper, are you, Captain?" "I'm whatever the mission needs me to be, sir," Emily said. "Today it needed a sniper. Most days it's needed something else. I've learned not to be picky about which version of myself gets used, as long as it gets used." The comment hung in the air, simple but devastating in what it revealed. And Briggs, a man who had commanded thousands of soldiers over the course of his career, found himself without an immediate response. Timestamp. It was now nearly 2 hours since the operation had begun, and as the adrenaline in the room slowly gave way to exhaustion, the full magnitude of what had happened began settling over everyone present in different ways. For Chambers, it settled as humility, a quiet recalibration of everything he thought he understood about who deserved a seat at the table. For Okafor, it settled as something closer to shame, the uncomfortable recognition that his first instinct upon seeing a quiet woman stand up in a room full of decorated marksmen had been dismissal rather than curiosity. For Whitfield, it settled as something almost like grief. The realization that an army built to identify and reward talent had somehow let this particular talent sit unused in an administrative role for 14 months, while 31 lives very nearly paid the price for that oversight. And for Emily, it settled as something she hadn't expected to feel at all. Not triumph, not vindication. Just a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, the kind that comes after holding a weight for far too long and finally being allowed to set it down. She sat down slowly in a chair near the wall, her notebook still clutched against her chest, and for the first time since she had opened it that morning, she allowed herself to close her eyes. Pollard sat down beside her without a word, and for a while neither of them spoke. The room moved around them, soldiers processing paperwork, Diaz coordinating with the convoy's return route, Briggs on a secure line with command relaying the outcome of the mission. But in the small pocket of quiet where Emily and Pollard sat, nothing needed to be said. "Can I ask you something?" Pollard finally said. "Go ahead." "When Whitfield called out that the target had moved right before you fired, what went through your mind?" Emily was quiet for a moment, considering the question honestly rather than reaching for something that sounded good. "Fear," she admitted. "Real fear. For about half a second, I thought I'd missed something, that 11 years of preparation had a hole in it I hadn't found yet. But then the training took over. I've spent so long learning to separate what I'm feeling from what I'm observing that even in that half second of panic, some part of me was already running the numbers on thermal distortion before the fear had time to finish forming." "That's a rare thing," Pollard said. "Most people, even the good shooters, let the fear win in moments like that. They second-guess themselves right out of the shot." "I've had a lot of practice not trusting my fear," Emily said. "For most of my career, the loudest voice in every room told me I didn't belong in it. If I'd let fear win every time somebody doubted me, I never would have made it this far." Pollard nodded slowly, understanding something in that sentence that went far beyond the events of the last 3 hours. Briggs's voice cut through the room a few minutes later, calling for everyone's attention as he finished his call with command. "Listen up. Command wants a full debrief on this operation within the hour, and they specifically want to understand how a shot that 13 qualified snipers determined was not viable ended up succeeding on the 14th attempt. Captain Carter, that means you're going to be doing most of the talking." Emily stood, some of her composure returning, though the exhaustion still sat heavy behind her eyes. "Understood, sir." "And Captain," Briggs added, his voice softening slightly, "I want you to understand something before we walk into that room. What you did today is going to get studied by people far above my pay grade. There are going to be officers who ask hard questions, who push back on your methods, because it's easier to question a new idea than to admit the old ones weren't good enough. I need you to be ready for that." "I've been getting questioned my whole career, sir," Emily said. "I can handle a debrief." Briggs almost smiled. "I believe you." The debrief, when it came, unfolded exactly as Briggs had warned. A cluster of senior officers, none of whom had been present in the room during the operation, sat across a long table from Emily, their expressions ranging from cautious curiosity to open skepticism. One colonel in particular, a stern man named Harrington, who had built his reputation on conventional ballistics doctrine, seemed determined to poke holes in every explanation Emily offered. "Captain Carter," Harrington said, flipping through a printed summary of her research papers that had been hastily compiled that afternoon. "You're telling this board that you identified a repeatable wind cycle in complex mountain terrain in real time under combat pressure using nothing but observational notes and mental math." "That's correct, sir. That's an extraordinary claim." "With respect, sir, I'm not asking you to take my word for it," Emily said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I'm asking you to look at the outcome. 13 shots using conventional windage calculation failed. 1 shot using cyclical thermal layer analysis succeeded, and it succeeded against a moving threat with a hostage relocated into the blast radius less than a minute before the shot was taken. The data speaks for itself." Harrington's expression didn't soften immediately, but something in his posture shifted, the reflexive defensiveness giving way, however grudgingly, to genuine consideration. "You've submitted papers on this before." "3 times, sir, beginning 6 years ago. And they were rejected. Filed without review, Emily corrected quietly. There's a difference. Harrington was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier edge. That's a difference this board intends to correct, Captain. I'd like copies of those papers sent directly to my office. All three of them. It wasn't an apology. Men like Harrington rarely offered those outright. But it was something, a door cracking open after years of staying firmly shut, and Emily recognized it for what it was. The debrief stretched on for nearly 2 hours, question after question, each one probing deeper into methods that Emily had spent over a decade refining in near total obscurity. By the end of it, something had visibly changed in the room. The skepticism that had greeted her at the start replaced by something closer to reluctant, dawning respect. When the meeting finally adjourned, Pollard was waiting for her outside, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, a small, tired smile on his face. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Better than I expected," Emily admitted. "Worse than it should have needed to be." "Story of your career, apparently," Pollard said, and there was no mockery in it, only quiet solidarity. They walked together for a while, the adrenaline of the day finally beginning to fade into the bone-deep tiredness that always followed missions like this one. The kind of tiredness that lived in the muscles long after the mind had processed what happened. "Can I tell you something?" Pollard said eventually. "Go ahead. 19 years I've been doing this job. I've trained under some of the best long-range instructors this country has ever produced. And in 19 years, I have never seen anyone read a wind pattern the way you read that valley today. Not once. I've read the reports on the world record shots, studied the men who made them, and none of it compares to watching someone build an entirely new framework for understanding terrain in real time under that kind of pressure. And be right." Emily was quiet for a moment, unsure how to absorb praise of that magnitude after so many years of receiving almost none at all. "I appreciate that," she finally said, "but I want to be honest with you. Today wasn't a lightning strike of talent. It was 11 years of unpaid, unrecognized work finally getting the 15 minutes it needed to matter. I've made that same calculation 1,000 times in empty ranges where nobody was watching. Today, someone finally was." Pollard nodded slowly. "Then maybe that's what needs to change. Not just you getting recognized. The whole way this army decides who gets watched in the first place." Word of what happened in that command center did not stay contained for long. Within days, the story had spread through the base, then through the broader command structure. Soldiers who hadn't been anywhere near the operation, repeating second-hand accounts that grew slightly more dramatic with every retelling. Though remarkably, the truth needed very little exaggeration to sound extraordinary. Emily found herself the subject of a kind of attention she had never experienced in 14 years of service. Soldiers she'd never spoken to nodding at her in hallways. Junior officers asking to shadow her during range time. Senior officers who had previously never bothered to learn her name, suddenly remembering it with surprising ease. She handled all of it the same way she had handled everything else in her career, with quiet, unshowy competence, neither seeking out the attention nor shrinking from it, simply continuing to do the work that had always mattered more to her than the recognition attached to it. But some things did change, and they changed in ways that mattered far beyond her own career. 3 weeks after this operation, Briggs summoned Emily to his office, and when she arrived, she found him seated behind a desk covered in the same 3 research papers she had submitted years earlier, now annotated heavily in red ink, along with a thick folder marked with a classification she didn't recognize. "Sit down, Captain," Briggs said, and something in his tone told her this was not going to be an ordinary conversation. She sat. "I've spent the last 3 weeks doing something I probably should have done the moment you stood up in that room," Briggs said. "I went back through your entire service record. Every posting, every evaluation, every research submission you ever filed." Emily said nothing, waiting. 14 years of service, Briggs continued, and for nearly half of that time, you were assigned to administrative and logistics roles despite consistently scoring in the top percentile on every marksmanship and ballistics evaluation this Army administers. Your research submissions were rejected or ignored by 3 separate commanding officers, none of whom, as far as I can tell, ever bothered to actually read past the first page. He slid the folder across the desk toward her. "What is this, sir?" "That," Briggs said, "is the beginning of a formal review into how talent gets identified and assigned in this command structure. Your case is going to be the primary example, not because I want to make an example of you, Captain, but because your case is the clearest evidence I have ever seen that this system has a serious blind spot, and I intend to make sure it gets fixed." Emily opened the folder slowly, scanning the first few pages, her eyes catching on language that described her situation with a clarity and bluntness she had rarely heard from anyone above her in the chain of command. "I don't know what to say, sir." "You don't need to say anything," Briggs said. "You already said everything that needed saying 3,847 meters away, under a countdown clock, with a hostage's life on the line. I'm just finally listening." He leaned back in his chair, studying her for a long moment. "Your thermal cycle analysis is being formally incorporated into advanced sniper training curriculum. Effective immediately," he continued. "You'll be developing the training modules yourself, working directly with the schoolhouse instructors. This isn't a temporary assignment, Captain. This is going to be your primary role going forward, unless you tell me you'd rather go back to logistics." For a moment, Emily couldn't quite process the offer. 11 years of quiet, unwitnessed work suddenly being handed the exact platform she had never dared to hope for. "I'd like the training role, sir," she said, her voice steadier now. "Very much." "Good," Briggs said, "because frankly, Captain, I don't think this army can afford to keep losing people like you to paperwork." Word of the training program spread quickly, and within months, soldiers from other units began requesting transfers specifically to train under the methods that had come to be known informally among the ranks as the Carter Protocol, a term Emily herself found faintly embarrassing every time she heard it, though she never corrected anyone who used it. Chambers was among the first to volunteer for the advanced coursework, showing up to her very first training session with the same quiet humility he'd shown in the moments after the shot. "Figured I'd start where the real education is," he said, taking a seat in the front row. "You already know how to shoot, Sergeant," Emily said. "I know how to shoot under conditions I understand," Chambers replied. "You taught me there's a whole category of conditions I never even knew I was missing. I'd like to learn the rest." Okafor joined the second cohort, arriving with considerably less fanfare, sliding quietly into a seat near the back of the room, the same position Emily herself had occupied not long before. When she called on him during a discussion of thermal layer delay calculations, he answered correctly, then added almost sheepishly, "I've been reading your old research papers, Captain. All 3 of them. I owe you an apology I don't think I said clearly enough that day." "You don't owe me anything, Sergeant," Emily said. "You showed up to learn. That's the only apology I need." Months turned into a season, and the training program expanded further, eventually drawing attention from outside the immediate command, other units requesting Emily's methods be incorporated into their own long-range training curricula. Her original notebooks, the same ones that had sat unread for 11 years, now treated as foundational texts, copied and distributed and studied by soldiers who had never even heard her name before that mission in the mountains. But amid all of it, the recognition, the new role, the sudden reversal of a career that had spent over a decade being quietly dismissed, Emily found herself returning again and again to the same simple truth she had told Briggs in his office that day. The shot had never really been about proving anyone wrong. It had been about being ready when the moment finally arrived, and holding on to that readiness through years when nobody else believed it mattered. Late one evening, months after the operation, Briggs found her alone in the training range, running calculations in a fresh notebook by the fading light, the same quiet, deliberate posture she'd held in the back of that command center on the day everything changed. "Still filling notebooks, Captain," he said, settling into the seat beside her. "Old habits, sir." "You know, I've thought a lot about that day," Briggs said, "about the fact that you sat in that room for 3 hours before anyone thought to ask what you were doing. 13 shots, 13 failures. And the entire time, the answer was sitting quietly in the corner, waiting to be asked the right question." Emily closed her notebook slowly, considering his words. "I've thought about it too, sir, and I've come to believe the lesson isn't really about me. No, it's about how many people are still sitting in the corner right now, in rooms all over this army, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. I got lucky. Someone ran out of options and looked my way. Most people in my position never get that moment." Briggs was quiet for a long time, watching the last light fade over the range. "Then I suppose it falls to people like me to stop waiting until we run out of options," he finally said. "To start asking the right questions before the crisis forces our hand." Emily allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first genuine one Briggs had seen from her since the day they'd met. "That would be a good place to start, sir." The training range fell quiet around them, The same stillness Emily had learned to find comfort in over 11 long years, except now, for the first time in her career, that stillness no longer felt like invisibility. It felt like preparation. And somewhere out beyond the range, in barracks and classrooms across a dozen different units, soldiers were already opening their own notebooks, already beginning to ask themselves the questions Emily Carter had spent a lifetime learning to answer. Questions about patience, about patterns hidden in plain sight, about the quiet, unglamorous discipline that turns an impossible shot into an inevitable one. None of them yet knew how far that lesson would carry them. None of them yet understood that the greatest victory to come out of that mountain valley wasn't the 3,800-meter shot that saved 31 lives. It was the simple, stubborn truth that talent doesn't always announce itself loudly, that sometimes it sits quietly for years, filling notebooks nobody reads, waiting for the one moment when the world finally, desperately, needs to ask the right question. The quiet on that training range did not last long. 3 days later, Emily was pulled out of a morning class session by a runner who told her Briggs needed her in his office immediately. And something in the young soldier's face told her this was not going to be another commendation. She walked into Briggs's office to find him standing at the window, his back to her, a single sheet of paper held loosely in one hand. "Sir," she said, "you wanted to see me." Briggs turned, and the expression on his face was one Emily had not seen from him before. Something tighter, more careful. The look of a man choosing his next words with unusual precision. "Colonel Marcus Whitlock," he said. "Does that name mean anything to you?" Emily felt something cold settle in her chest. "Yes, sir. He was my commanding officer during my first posting. He's the one who filed my early research without review." "He's requested a formal meeting with command leadership," Briggs said. "He's disputing the account of what happened in that room 3 weeks ago." Emily blinked. "Disputing what exactly, sir? There were 14 witnesses. There's a recorded transmission log. The hostages are alive." "He's not disputing that the shot happened," Briggs said, setting the paper down on his desk and sliding it toward her. "He's disputing the credit." Emily picked up the paper and read it slowly, and with each line, the cold feeling in her chest spread further, settling into something closer to disbelief. The document was a formal statement, submitted through official channels, claiming that the thermal cycle methodology used in the operation had originally been developed under Whitlock's direct supervision during Emily's early service, that she had built her calculations on a foundation he had established, and that any recognition for the breakthrough should be shared, if not primarily credited, to his early mentorship. "This is not true," Emily said, and her voice, usually so controlled, carried an edge Briggs had not heard from her before. "Colonel Whitlock never once discussed thermal layer interaction with me. He rejected 3 papers on the subject without reading past the summary page. I have the original submission dates. I have his own handwritten notes dismissing the work as, and I'm quoting directly, sir, theoretical noise with no practical application." "I believe you, Captain," Briggs said, "but belief isn't evidence, and Whitlock has spent 26 years building relationships in this command structure that you have not had time to build. This is going to be a fight." Emily set the paper down carefully, forcing her hands to stay steady even as anger burned through her, sharper than anything she'd felt standing at that rifle 3 weeks earlier. Why would he do this now? He had years to claim credit for something he actually believed in. He didn't believe in it. He buried it. "I have a theory," Briggs said quietly, "and I don't like it." "Tell me." "Whitlock is up for his first star this cycle," Briggs said. "General officer selection boards look hard at a colonel's record of developing talent and innovation within their command. A story about a colonel who buried a soldier's groundbreaking research for 6 years is not the kind of story that gets a man promoted. But a story about a colonel who mentored the soldier who made the impossible shot, that's a very different story." Emily sat down slowly in the chair across from Briggs's desk, the weight of what he was describing settling over her. "So he's trying to rewrite what actually happened because the truth would end his career." "That's my read on it, yes. And if he succeeds." Briggs's jaw tightened. "If he succeeds, Captain, then the training program we built, the one carrying your name informally through every unit that's requested it, gets quietly reattributed. Your role gets diminished. And 11 years of work that finally got its due credit 3 weeks ago goes right back into the shadow it came from." Emily felt something settle inside her then. Not panic, not the cold, creeping dread from a moment earlier, but something harder, more familiar. She had spent her entire career being underestimated, overlooked, filed away. She recognized this feeling. She had simply never expected to face it again after that mountain valley had seemingly changed everything. "What do I need to do?" she asked. "There's going to be a formal review board," Briggs said. "Whitlock requested it himself, which tells me he's confident he can win it. You'll need to present your case, and I have to warn you, Captain, boards like this one don't always favor the truth. They favor the version of the truth that's easiest for the institution to accept." "Then I'll make sure the truth is easy to accept," Emily said, "because it happens to also be documented." Timestamp. The review board was scheduled for 8 days later, and in that time, Emily found herself doing something she had done countless times before in her career, quietly methodically building an airtight case out of evidence nobody else had bothered to organize. She spent 4 straight nights in the records office, pulling every submission she had ever filed, cross-referencing dates, signatures, rejection notes written in Whitlock's own handwriting. She found the original memo where he had dismissed her third paper, the one that contained the earliest draft of the exact thermal delay calculations that had saved 31 lives in that mountain valley. A memo that read, in blunt, dismissive language, that her time would be better spent focusing on administrative competencies rather than what he called speculative theory with no field application. She photographed every page. She built a timeline. She tracked down 2 former colleagues who had witnessed Whitlock's dismissals firsthand and were willing to submit written statements, though both admitted privately to Emily that they were nervous about testifying against a colonel who still held considerable influence over promotion boards across multiple commands. "You understand what you're asking us to do," one of them, a former logistics sergeant named Ruiz, told her over a phone call. "Whitlock's got friends. This could follow us." "I understand," Emily said, "and I won't hold it against either of you if you decide it's not worth the risk. But I'm asking anyway because if I don't, he gets to rewrite 11 years of my life into a footnote in his promotion packet." Ruiz was quiet for a long moment. "Send me the statement. I'll sign it." Pollard, when he learned what was happening, showed up at the records office on the third night without being asked, carrying 2 cups of coffee and an expression that told Emily he had already made up his mind about whose side he was standing on. "Heard about Whitlock," he said, setting one of the coffees down beside her. "News travels fast." "News like this always does," Pollard said, pulling up a chair. "Chambers heard it from Alvarez. Alvarez heard it from someone in personnel. By the time it got to me, it had already turned into 3 different rumors, one of which had you being court-martialed, which I'm fairly confident is not accurate." Despite everything, Emily let out a short, tired laugh. "Not accurate. Good, because I already told Chambers I'd testify if it came to that, and I don't want to have wasted the offer." Pollard's tone shifted, growing more serious. "I mean it, Captain. I was in that room. I watched you predict a wind cycle down to the second while a hostage's life hung on a 6-second window. I don't care what Whitlock claims happened 6 years ago. I care about what I saw with my own eyes 3 weeks ago, and I'll say so under oath if that's what this takes." Emily felt something loosen in her chest. The isolation that had defined so much of her career suddenly, unexpectedly, giving way to something she hadn't fully let herself trust yet. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That actually means more than you probably realize." "I think I realize exactly how much it means," Pollard said. "You spent 11 years with nobody in your corner. I'd like to be the first name on a much longer list." By the 5th night, the list had grown considerably. Chambers submitted a statement describing his own failed attempts and the moment Emily's analysis had changed the entire trajectory of the operation. Okafor, despite his earlier skepticism, wrote a statement so thorough and detailed that Briggs later told Emily it read less like testimony and more like an apology letter that happened to also contain admissible evidence. Even Whitfield, still visibly embarrassed about his false alarm during the operation, insisted on contributing a statement describing exactly how Emily had corrected his mistake in real time without ever making him feel small for making it. Diaz went further still, pulling the original communication logs from the operation and cross-referencing timestamps to prove definitively that Emily's calculations had been developed and communicated live, in real time, with no possibility of prior coaching or preparation from anyone, let alone a colonel who hadn't been anywhere near that command center. "This should be enough," Diaz said, handing Emily a thick folder of compiled evidence on the 6th night. I don't see how any review board looks at this and sides with Whitlock. You'd be surprised what review boards are capable of overlooking when the alternative is embarrassing for the institution, Emily said. But there was less fear in her voice now than there had been a week earlier, replaced by the same disciplined calm that had carried her through the mountain valley. Timestamp. The morning of the review board arrived, and Emily walked into the hearing room to find Whitlock already seated at the far end of a long table, flanked by two aides, his uniform immaculate, his expression carrying the confident ease of a man who had spent decades learning exactly how institutions protected their own. He looked up as she entered, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face, not quite recognition, not quite respect, something closer to the mild irritation of a man forced to deal with an inconvenience he had assumed would never resurface. "Captain Carter," he said, his voice smooth and unbothered, "I want you to know I have nothing but admiration for what you accomplished in that valley. This isn't personal." "It feels personal, sir," Emily said evenly, taking her seat across from him. "You're claiming credit for work you actively rejected 6 years ago." "I'm claiming the mentorship role I provided during a formative period of your career," Whitlock said smoothly. "Every soldier's success builds on the foundation their early commanders gave them, whether they recognize it at the time or not." The board, composed of 3 senior officers Emily had never met, sat quietly at the head of the table, their expressions carefully neutral, giving away nothing about which version of events they were inclined to believe. The senior board member, a 2-star general named Reyes with a weathered face and sharp, assessing eyes, opened the proceedings. "Colonel Whitlock, Captain Carter, we're here today to review competing claims regarding the origin and development of the thermal cycle analysis methodology used in the operation 3 weeks ago. I want to remind both parties that this board's interest is in the truth, not in either party's career prospects. Colonel, you may begin." Whitlock spoke first, and he spoke well, Emily had to admit, weaving a narrative that was technically not built entirely on lies, describing his early command, describing Emily's initial training under his oversight, carefully omitting the specific details of how he had actually treated her research, while emphasizing vague, unfalsifiable claims about the mentorship environment he had supposedly cultivated. "Every young officer under my command received guidance on ballistics theory as part of standard training," Whitlock said. "Captain Carter's early exposure to thermal dynamics concepts began under that guidance. I don't claim to have invented her methodology. I claim to have provided the foundation upon which it was built." General Reyes turned to Emily. "Captain, your response." Emily opened the folder in front of her hands steady despite the pressure of 3 unfamiliar senior officers watching her every word. "General, I'd like to enter into record 3 research submissions I filed during my service under Colonel Whitlock's command, along with his handwritten evaluation notes attached to each one." She slid the documents across the table. Reyes picked up the first one, scanning it slowly, his expression unreadable. "This first paper, submitted 6 years ago, contains the earliest version of the thermal layer delay calculation that ultimately became the foundation of the methodology used in the successful operation," Emily continued. Colonel Whitlock's handwritten note, visible at the bottom of the final page, reads, quote, "Theoretical noise with no practical application. Recommend reassignment to administrative duties," end quote. Reyes's eyes flicked up from the page toward Whitlock, whose expression had not changed but whose jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. "Colonel," Reyes said, "do you recall writing this note?" "I don't recall the specific language," Whitlock said carefully, "but I don't dispute providing critical feedback as part of standard mentorship. Feedback that pushes a young officer to refine their thinking is not the same as rejection." "It reads as rejection," said the second board member, a stern-faced brigadier general who had remained silent until now. "It explicitly recommends reassignment away from the very work you are now claiming credit for fostering." "With respect, General," Whitlock said, "context matters. That was 6 years ago. My understanding and appreciation for the captain's work has evolved considerably since then." "Your understanding evolved considerably in the last 3 weeks, is what I'm hearing," the brigadier general said dryly. And for the first time, Emily saw something crack in Whitlock's composed exterior, a flicker of genuine alarm before he smoothed it back over. Emily continued, sliding the second and third papers across the table, each accompanied by similarly dismissive notes, each one methodically dismantling the narrative Whitlock had spent the last week constructing. I'd also like to submit written statements from 4 soldiers who witnessed my methodology being developed and applied in real time during the operation, Emily said, along with communication logs proving there was no possibility of prior coordination between myself and Colonel Whitlock, who was not present during the operation and had no communication with anyone in that command center before, during, or after the mission. Reyes accepted the statements, flipping through them slowly, his expression growing more severe with each page. Colonel Whitlock, Reyes finally said, setting the papers down, I have in front of me documentation showing you rejected this methodology on 3 separate occasions, in writing, with explicit recommendations that Captain Carter be reassigned away from research entirely. I also have 4 independent witness statements confirming that the application of this methodology during the recent operation was developed and communicated live, with no involvement from you whatsoever. I'm having difficulty understanding the basis for your claim. Whitlock's composure, so carefully maintained throughout the hearing, finally began to slip. General, I think it's important to consider the broader context of institutional mentorship, the way early command environments shape. Colonel, Reyes interrupted, his voice sharpening into something that left no room for further deflection. I've reviewed enough evidence in the last 20 minutes to understand exactly what happened here. You dismissed this officer's work for 6 years, and now that it's saved 31 lives and earned national attention within command circles, you're attempting to retroactively insert yourself into a success story you actively obstructed. I find that deeply troubling and, frankly, unbecoming of an officer with your record. The room went very quiet. Whitlock's aides exchanged a brief, uncomfortable glance. Emily kept her expression neutral, though inside, something that had been coiled tight in her chest for 8 straight days finally began to loosen. General, Whitlock tried again, his voice noticeably less smooth now. I don't believe intent should be conflated with outcome. Regardless of my initial evaluation, the fact remains, Reyes said, cutting him off a second time, that you attempted to claim credit for work you dismissed using language calculated to obscure your actual role in a formal statement submitted through official channels. That is not a minor administrative dispute, Colonel. That is a serious integrity concern, and this board will be referring the matter for further review outside the scope of today's hearing. The words landed like a verdict, and Emily watched as the confident, unbothered posture Whitlock had walked in with finally completely collapsed. Timestamp. The hearing concluded less than 10 minutes later, the board unanimously affirming that the thermal cycle methodology belonged entirely to Emily's independent research and development, with no contribution from Colonel Whitlock at any stage. The formal record was corrected, the training program retained her name, and the matter of Whitlock's conduct, as Reyes had promised, was referred for a separate, far more serious review. Outside the hearing room, Briggs was waiting, and the look on his face told Emily everything she needed to know before he said a word. I heard, he said. Word travels fast in this building. It should have been over in 10 minutes, Emily said, some of the exhaustion of the last 8 days finally showing through. It felt like it took 8 days to prove something that was true from the very beginning. That's usually how it goes when someone tries to rewrite the truth instead of just accepting it, Briggs said. But you handled it exactly the way you handled that valley. Patient, methodical, undeniable once the evidence was laid out. I had help this time, Emily said, thinking of Pollard's coffee, Chambers' statement, Okafor's apology disguised as testimony, Diaz's meticulous timeline. I didn't do this one alone. No, Briggs agreed, a small, genuine smile crossing his face for the first time since this whole ordeal had begun. And maybe that's the real difference between the woman who sat in that corner 3 weeks ago and the woman standing in front of me now. It's not that your work changed, it's that you finally stopped having to prove it by yourself. Word of the hearing's outcome spread through the base even faster than word of Whitlock's initial claim had. Chambers found Emily later that afternoon in the training range, a wide grin on his face that he made no effort to hide. Heard Whitlock walked out of there looking like a man who just watched his own promotion packet catch fire, he said. That's roughly accurate, Emily said. And for the first time in over a week, she allowed herself to laugh, a real laugh, unguarded and tired and relieved all at once. You know what this means, Chambers said. Every soldier on this base is going to hear exactly what kind of colonel spends 6 years burying a researcher's work and then tries to steal credit for it the moment it saves 31 lives. That's not a story that goes away quietly. I'm not interested in destroying his career, Chambers, Emily said. I just wanted the truth on the record. I know, Chambers said. That's exactly why everyone in this building is on your side. You didn't ask for revenge, you just asked to be believed. Turns out that's a lot more powerful than revenge ever could have been. Okafor approached a few minutes later, standing a little more stiffly than usual, the way he always did when something weighed on him that he hadn't quite figured out how to say. Captain, he said, I want you to know, writing that statement was the easiest thing I've done in this uniform in a long time. After everything, after doubting you in that room, after watching you prove every one of us wrong in the best possible way, standing up for you when someone tried to steal that from you felt less like an obligation and more like finally paying a debt I owed. You don't owe me anything, Sergeant, Emily said, echoing the same words she'd told him weeks earlier. Maybe not, Okafor said, but I'm still glad I got the chance to pay it anyway. Timestamp. In the weeks that followed, the training program Emily had built continued to expand, now operating under a level of institutional protection it had never had before. Briggs personally ensuring that no future commanding officer would ever again have the authority to bury research the way Whitlock had buried hers. But something else had shifted too, something less official, but no less significant. The soldiers who trained under her no longer approached her methodology as a curiosity to be tested or a fluke to be explained away. They approached it as a discipline to be mastered, a body of knowledge built by someone who had earned every ounce of authority behind it. Twice over now, once in that mountain valley and once in a hearing room where the truth had very nearly been stolen out from under her. Late one evening, sitting alone in the records office where she had spent so many exhausting nights building her case against Whitlock, Emily found herself looking through her original notebooks one more time, the same pages that had once been dismissed as theoretical noise, now serving as the foundation for a training curriculum being taught across multiple commands. Pollard found her there, as he often did lately, leaning against the doorway with the same quiet, easy presence he'd carried since the day the mission had ended. Still working, he said. Old habits, Emily said, echoing the same words she'd once given Briggs. You know, Pollard said, stepping into the room, I've been thinking about something Whitlock said in that hearing, about every success building on some foundation someone else provided. He was lying, Emily said. He was lying about himself being that foundation, Pollard said. But he wasn't entirely wrong about the principle. You didn't build any of this alone, Captain. Not the shot in that valley, and not the hearing that just protected it. You had 13 failed attempts ahead of you that taught you exactly what not to trust. You had a general willing to listen when nobody else would. You had soldiers willing to stand up for you when someone tried to take that away. Emily closed the notebook slowly, considering his words. I spent so many years believing I had to do everything alone, because for so long that was the only option anyone gave me. And now I think maybe the real lesson isn't that talent survives in isolation, Emily said quietly. Maybe it's that talent shouldn't have to. Maybe the whole point of what happened these last few weeks is proving that when the right people finally do pay attention, everything moves faster, holds stronger, survives challenges that would have crushed it if it had stayed alone in that corner. Pollard nodded slowly, understanding settling over his weathered face. Then I suppose the next question is what you do with that lesson now that you've learned it. Emily looked down at the notebook in her hands. 11 years of quiet, overlooked work that had somehow, against every obstacle placed in its way, finally found the recognition it deserved. Not once, but twice. First in a mountain valley under a countdown clock, and now in a hearing room where the truth had nearly been stolen by a man protecting his own ambition. I think, she said slowly, the next question isn't really about me anymore. Outside, the base had gone quiet for the evening. The same kind of stillness Emily had learned to find comfort in over so many solitary years, except now that stillness carried something different inside it. Not the loneliness of being overlooked, but the steady, grounded confidence of someone who had finally, undeniably been seen, and who understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else in that command structure, exactly how many other soldiers were still waiting quietly in their own corners for someone to finally ask them the right question. The question of what came next did not stay abstract for long. 6 weeks after the hearing that ended Whitlock's promotion bid, Briggs called Emily into his office again, and this time instead of a formal document waiting on his desk, there was a simple manila folder and an expression on his face that looked almost nervous, which was not a look Emily had ever seen him wear before. Sit down, Captain, Haas said. I've got something I need to run by you, and I want your honest reaction, not the polite one. Emily sat, curiosity overtaking the small flicker of caution that any summons to this office now carried after the Whitlock affair. Yes, sir. Command wants to take your training program national, Briggs said. Not just this base, not just the units that have already requested it informally. They want a standardized curriculum built around your methodology, taught at the schoolhouse level, mandatory coursework for every advanced marksman training pipeline in the Army. Emily sat with that for a moment, the scale of it settling over her slowly. That's every long-range program in the country, sir. That's every long-range program in the country, Briggs confirmed. And they want you to lead the development, not consult on it. Lead it, which means relocating to the schoolhouse, building a full staff, writing doctrine that soldiers will be studying for the next 20 years. That's an enormous shift, sir. It is, Briggs agreed, and I told them I wouldn't answer for you. This has to be your decision, Captain, because I know better than almost anyone how many times decisions about your career got made without you in the room. I wasn't about to add myself to that list. Something in Emily's chest tightened at that, not from doubt, but from the simple, still unfamiliar experience of someone in power choosing to hand a decision back to her instead of making it for her. Can I have a few days to think it over, sir? Take a week, Briggs said. This isn't a decision anyone should rush. Emily spent that week the way she spent most difficult decisions, methodically, turning the question over in her notebook the same way she once turned over wind patterns, weighing costs against outcomes, searching for the pattern hidden beneath the noise of her own uncertainty. Pollard found her on the third night, sitting alone at the edge of the training range long after the sun had gone down, her notebook open on her knee, illuminated by nothing but the weak glow of a small flashlight clipped to her collar. Briggs told me about the offer, he said, settling onto the ground beside her without waiting for an invitation. Word travels fast in this command, Emily said, echoing words that had become something of a running joke between them since the hearing. It does when the person at the center of the story keeps doing things worth talking about, Pollard said. So, what's the notebook telling you? Emily closed it slowly. The notebook doesn't have an opinion on this one. This isn't a wind pattern. There's no cycle to observe, no data to collect that tells me the right answer. Then what's actually stopping you? Emily was quiet for the long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability that even Pollard, who had spent the last 2 months earning her trust one quiet gesture at a time, had rarely heard from her. Fear, she admitted. Not fear of failing. I've spent my whole career comfortable with the possibility of failing quietly, where nobody's watching. This is different. If I take this role and it doesn't work, if the doctrine I write doesn't hold up, if soldiers train under my methods and something goes wrong in the field because of a gap I didn't anticipate, that failure doesn't stay quiet. That failure gets studied. It gets written into after-action reports. It costs lives instead of just costing me a promotion. That's a heavy thing to carry, Pollard said quietly. It's the same thing I carried into that valley, Emily said. Yeah, you died. Except in that valley, I only had to be right once. This is asking me to be right forever, for every soldier who ever opens the manual I write. Pollard considered this for a long moment, staring out at the darkened range in front of them. Can I tell you something my old instructor told me, back when I was younger than half the soldiers training under you now? Go ahead. He told me that the moment you stop being afraid of getting it wrong is the moment you've stopped taking the job seriously enough to get it right. He said the fear isn't the enemy, Captain. The fear is the thing that keeps you checking your math 3 times instead of twice. It's the thing that made you spend 11 years filling notebooks nobody read, because some part of you understood that being right actually mattered, even when nobody else was paying attention. Emily turned to look at him, something shifting behind her eyes. You're not being asked to be perfect, Pollard continued. You're being asked to bring the same discipline that saved 31 lives into a room where you get to teach it to everyone who comes after you. That's not a burden, Captain. That's the whole reason this Army finally has a chance to stop losing people like you to filing cabinets. Timestamp. Emily accepted the position 4 days later, and the transition that followed unfolded faster than she had anticipated. A flurry of paperwork, relocations, staff meetings, and the slow, deliberate process of translating 11 years of solitary notebooks into a curriculum that could be taught, tested, and trusted by soldiers who had never met her and never would. The first cohort to train under the newly formalized program arrived 3 months later, 42 soldiers pulled from units across the country, each one carrying some version of the same skepticism that had once filled that command center on the day of the mission. The quiet, reflexive doubt of people trained to trust proven methods over unproven theory. Emily stood in front of them on the first morning, and for a moment the old, familiar instinct rose up in her, the urge to shrink slightly, to soften her presence in a room full of people who had not yet earned the reason to believe her. She pushed the instinct down, the same way she had pushed down her fear in that mountain valley, and began to speak. "My name is Captain Emily Carter," she said. 3 months ago, most of you had never heard that name. Some of you have now heard a version of a story about a shot I took in a mountain valley, and I want to start by telling you that story is true, but it's not the most important part of what you're here to learn. A murmur passed through the room, confusion flickering across several faces. "The most important part isn't the shot," Emily continued. "It's the 11 years before it. 11 years of watching wind patterns nobody asked me to watch. 11 years of filling notebooks that got filed away without being read. 11 years of being told, more times than I can count, that what I was studying didn't have practical application. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you this because every single one of you is going to spend years of your career doing work that feels unglamorous, unnoticed, and unrewarded. And I need you to understand before you ever fire a single round in this program that the discipline you build in those quiet years is the only thing that will be there for you in the loud ones." A young soldier in the front row, barely into his 20s, raised his hand hesitantly. "Captain, did you ever think about quitting? During those 11 years, I mean. Did you ever think the notebooks weren't worth it?" Emily considered the question honestly, the way she considered every question that mattered. "Every year," she said, "sometimes every month. There were entire seasons where I genuinely believed the work would never matter to anyone but me. But I kept filling the pages anyway, because somewhere underneath the doubt, I believed the patterns I was seeing were real, even if nobody else was ready to see them yet. That belief is not the same as confidence. Confidence is easy when people are cheering you on. What I'm asking you to build in this program is something harder. I'm asking you to build conviction, the kind that survives silence." The room was quiet after that, the kind of quiet that carried weight instead of emptiness. And Emily understood, standing there in front of 42 soldiers who had come from bases across the country, that something had already begun shifting, not because of anything dramatic, but because for the first time in most of their careers, someone was telling them the truth about what this work actually demanded. Timestamp. The program's first major test came 4 months into the curriculum when a request arrived from an active deployment overseas, a long-range operation eerily similar in its impossible parameters to the mission that had started everything. A target positioned at extreme range through complex mountainous terrain, with a tight window and lives hanging on the outcome. Command requested that Emily's newest and most promising trainee, a quiet, methodical soldier named Corporal Sarah Kim, who had reminded Emily of herself from the very first week of the program, be flown out to support the operation directly. Emily stood in the operations room as the request came through, and for a moment, old fear rose up in her chest, sharp and immediate, the terror of watching someone she had trained step into the exact kind of moment that had once nearly broken her. "She's ready," Briggs said, standing beside her, reading the hesitation on her face with the same clarity he'd learned to read in her since that first day. "You built her the same way you built yourself, patient, methodical, undeniable once the evidence is laid out. Knowing something intellectually and watching it happen in real time are two very different things," Emily admitted. "Welcome to command," Briggs said, not unkindly. "That feeling doesn't go away. You just learn to carry it without letting it show." The mission unfolded over the following 6 hours, relayed back through intermittent, static-filled transmissions that Emily monitored from a secure line, her hands tight around a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier without her noticing. Kim's voice, when it finally came through clear, carried the same disciplined, calm Emily had worked so hard to instill in her, the same refusal to let fear override observation. "Command, this is Corporal Kim. I've identified a delayed thermal cycle consistent with training parameters, requesting authorization to hold for window confirmation." Emily closed her eyes, listening to her own methodology, her own years of solitary notebooks, being spoken aloud by someone else entirely. Someone who had learned to see the invisible architecture of wind and mountain the same way Emily once had. Except this time, She hadn't had to learn it alone in 11 years of silence. She had learned it in 4 months, guided, supported, believed in from the very beginning. Authorization granted, the operator on the line responded. Proceed at your discretion, Corporal. The transmission went quiet for nearly 90 seconds, the exact length of the cycle Emily had first identified in that mountain valley so many months earlier. And in that silence, Emily found herself gripping the edge of the console, every instinct in her body reaching across the distance toward a soldier she couldn't touch, couldn't guide, could only trust. Window confirmed, Kim's voice finally came through, taking the shot. The silence that followed felt identical to the one Emily remembered from her own operation. The same suspended, unbearable stretch of time where an entire mission balanced on a single decision made under impossible pressure. Then, finally, the words that broke the tension wide open. Target confirmed down. All friendly forces accounted for. Mission successful. The operations room erupted into quiet, controlled celebration, but Emily found herself sitting motionless for a long moment, tears gathering in her eyes that she made no attempt to hide because, in that instant, she understood something with a clarity that no amount of training or preparation could have given her beforehand. This was never just going to be about the one shot she took. It was about every shot that would come after it, taken by soldiers who would never have to sit alone in a corner for 11 years, filling notebooks nobody read, waiting for a crisis desperate enough to finally ask them the right question. Briggs found her a few minutes later, still sitting quietly at the console, and he didn't say anything at first, simply pulled up a chair and sat beside her the way Pollard so often did, offering presence instead of words. She did it, Emily finally said, her voice thick with an emotion she hadn't fully anticipated. She actually did it. She did, Briggs agreed, but she didn't do it alone, Captain. She did it because someone finally built her the foundation you never had. That's not a small thing. That's the entire point of everything you've built these last several months. Timestamp. Word of Kim's successful operation spread through the training program almost as quickly as word of Emily's own mission had spread a year earlier. Except this time, the story carried a different weight, proof not of one extraordinary individual, but of a methodology, a discipline, a system finally strong enough to produce success again and again, independent of any single person's singular brilliance. Kim returned to the training facility 3 weeks later, and when she found Emily in the same records office where so much of the program's foundation had been built, she stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. The same hesitant respect Emily remembered from her own early encounters with soldiers who didn't yet know how to address someone who had changed the course of their career without ever asking for the credit. Captain, Kim finally said, I don't think I properly thanked you before I deployed. You don't need to thank me, Corporal, Emily said. You did the work. I just made sure you didn't have to do it in silence. That's the part I keep coming back to, Kim said, stepping into the room. Everyone talks about your shot, the 3,800 meters, the impossible window. But sitting out there, waiting for that cycle to align, all I could think about was how differently that moment would have felt if I'd had to figure it out completely alone, the way you did. I had your notebooks. I had 4 months of training built on 11 years of your mistakes and corrections. I don't think people understand what a gift that actually is. Emily felt something settle deep in her chest, a kind of peace she hadn't expected to feel this early into a career she had once assumed would end quietly, unnoticed, buried in administrative postings and rejected research papers. I think, Emily said slowly, that might be the actual answer to a question I've been asking myself since I accepted this position. I was so afraid of the weight of getting this wrong for everyone who trains under this program. I never fully let myself consider what it would feel like to get it right. Timestamp. Over the following year, the program Emily built continued to expand. Its methodology no longer treated as an unconventional theory, but as established doctrine, taught not just to snipers, but eventually incorporated into broader artillery and long-range targeting training across multiple branches of service. Colonel Whitlock's career, meanwhile, quietly ended in early retirement following the extended review that had been referred after the hearing, a fact that Emily learned about secondhand and received with far less satisfaction than she might have expected a year earlier. She had never wanted revenge. She had only ever wanted the truth to hold, and once it had, she found she had little appetite left for watching anyone's downfall, even a man who had spent 6 years actively working against her. What she found herself caring about instead, increasingly, was the growing list of soldiers who passed through her program, each one carrying some version of the same story she once had, some quiet talent overlooked by a system that hadn't yet learned to look for it in the right places. She built into the curriculum something no formal military training program had ever explicitly required before, a mandatory review process ensuring that any soldier's independent research or theoretical work be read, evaluated, and formally responded to within 30 days, regardless of rank or posting. A policy that Briggs championed all the way up the chain of command, citing Emily's own buried papers as the clearest evidence anyone in that structure had ever seen for why the policy mattered. The policy became known, informally at first, and then in official training documentation, as the Carter Standard, a name Emily still found faintly uncomfortable every time she heard it, though she had long since stopped correcting people who used it, understanding finally that the discomfort was simply the residue of 11 years spent believing her work didn't deserve a name attached to it at all. On the one-year anniversary of the mission, Briggs invited the original team back together, the same soldiers who had stood in that command center watching 13 shots fail, before a woman nobody had thought to ask finally changed everything. Chambers arrived first, now serving as a senior instructor within Emily's own program, having spent the last year building a career around teaching the exact methodology he'd once doubted enough to volunteer ahead of. Okafor came next, quieter than before but steadier, carrying himself with the confidence of a man who had learned the hard way the value of questioning his own assumptions before questioning someone else's competence. Whitfield arrived with Alvarez, the two of them still occasionally trading jokes about the false alarm that had nearly cost the operation its perfect timing, though the jokes had long since lost their sting and become instead a kind of shared, hard-won camaraderie. Diaz came in scrubs, having transferred to a medical support role, but making the trip anyway, unwilling to miss the anniversary of a mission she still described as the most important night of her career. Pollard was the last to arrive, and when he found Emily standing near the edge of the training range where their most important conversations always seemed to happen, he carried 2 cups of coffee, the same gesture that had marked the beginning of a friendship neither of them had expected, but both had come to rely on deeply. 1 year, he said, handing her the cup. 1 year, Emily agreed, taking it, looking out over the range where dozens of new soldiers were currently working through drills built on methodologies she had spent 11 solitary years developing. You know what I keep thinking about, Pollard said. What's that? That night, right before the shot, when Whitfield thought the target had moved. You didn't just have the composure to keep going. You had the composure to explain, clearly, calmly, exactly why he was wrong, without ever making him feel stupid for speaking up. I've thought about that moment more than almost anything else from that night, because that's the moment I understood you weren't just going to make one impossible shot. You were going to spend the rest of your career making everyone around you better at making shots of their own. Emily was quiet for a moment, watching the soldiers below run through drills she had built from scratch. Soldiers who would never know the particular loneliness of 11 years spent filling notebooks. Nobody read, because the system that had once ignored her had finally, permanently changed. I used to think the shot was the whole story, she finally said. The 3,800 meters. The impossible window. The moment everyone finally saw what I'd been capable of the whole time. But I don't think that's the real story anymore. What's the real story? Emily looked at him, and for the first time since that long, impossible night in the mountain valley, her expression carried none of the guarded caution that had defined so much of her career. The real story is that talent doesn't need a crisis to matter, she said. It only needed someone to finally ask the right question before the crisis arrived. I got my answer the hard way, in a room where 13 people had already failed and 31 lives were running out of time. Every soldier training on that range right now is going to get their answer a different way, because we built something strong enough that they'll never have to sit alone in a corner for 11 years, waiting for someone to notice them. Briggs joined them a few minutes later, watching the same drills unfold below, the quiet satisfaction of a man who had spent his career learning, sometimes too late, exactly how much talent his own institution had once been capable of losing. You know, Captain, he said, I think about that day more than I probably should. 13 failures. A general standing in a room asking a question he genuinely believed had no answer left to give. And the whole time the answer was sitting quietly in the corner, waiting. I think about it too, sir, Emily said, but I've stopped thinking about it as the story of one impossible shot. I think about it now as the story of every soldier who never has to wait in that corner again, because someone finally learned to ask the right question before it was too late. The training range stretched out below them, full of soldiers who carried Emily's discipline forward into futures she would never fully witness. Each one a small, living proof that the quietest people in any room often carry the answers everyone else is too loud to hear, and that the true measure of an impossible shot was never really about the distance it traveled. It was about how many lives it changed long after the sound of it had faded into silence. And on that mountain in that valley, on that single unforgettable night, Captain Emily Carter did not just save 31 lives with one extraordinary shot. She proved once and for all that greatness does not always announce itself loudly, that sometimes it waits quietly for years, filling page after page with patience nobody else understood, until the exact moment the world finally has no choice left but to ask the one question that changes everything. History does not remember most of its quiet correction. It remembers the explosion, the single dramatic moment when a system finally bends to accommodate a truth it spent years refusing to see. It rarely remembers the years of silence that came before that moment, and it almost never remembers the ordinary people who lived inside those years, filling their own version of Emily Carter's notebooks, waiting for a question that might never come. Briggs understood this now in a way he hadn't a year earlier, and standing beside Emily on the edge of that training range, watching a new generation of soldiers run drills built from her methodology, he found himself thinking not just about the mission, but about every mission like it that history had already quietly buried. "You know what strikes me most looking back," he said. "It isn't that 13 good snipers failed before you stood up. Good people fail at impossible things all the time. What strikes me is how close this army came to never finding out what you were capable of at all. If Rahimi hadn't taken that convoy, if the mission hadn't run out of options, you might have spent your entire career in administrative postings, and none of us would ever have known what we lost." Emily considered this in silence for a moment, watching a young trainee below adjust his position exactly the way she had taught him to, patient, deliberate, unhurried by the pressure of an instructor's gaze. "That's the part that used to keep me up at night," she finally said. "Not the 11 years of being overlooked. I made peace with that a long time ago. What kept me up at night was wondering how many other people never got their crisis. How many people just as capable as I was spent their whole careers in the corner, and the mission that needed them never came, or came at a moment when nobody desperate enough was left to finally ask the right question." It was, Briggs realized, the same quiet, unglamorous discipline that had defined every part of her journey, the refusal to let her own vindication become the entire lesson. She had been right. The army had been wrong, but somewhere underneath that simple truth sat a harder, more uncomfortable one. The understanding that institutions do not fail by accident. They fail through 1,000 small decisions made by reasonable people, protecting reasonable assumptions. A commanding officer who genuinely believed theoretical work belonged in a classroom. A promotion board that genuinely believed proven methods were safer than unproven ones. A room full of decorated snipers who genuinely believed that if the shot were truly possible, one of them would already know how to make it. None of them had been villains. That was the part people struggled with most when they first heard the story, the instinct to look for someone to blame, a single figure whose malice explained 11 years of buried research. But malice was rare. Institutional blindness rarely required it. It required only the far more common, far more forgivable failure of never thinking to ask a different question, never wondering what talent might be sitting quietly in a corner, filling notebooks nobody had bothered to open. This was not a new story, though it wore new clothing. Emily had begun reading in the months since the hearing about others who had walked similar roads long before her. Engineers whose designs sat in drawers for decades before a crisis finally forced someone to open them. Scientists whose theories were dismissed by the very institutions that would later build entire fields upon them. Soldiers throughout history who had understood something true about the battlefield years before anyone in command was desperate enough to listen. The names changed. The uniforms changed. The specific nature of the overlooked genius changed from decade to decade, from war to war, from institution to institution. But the pattern held with an almost unsettling consistency, the same story told again and again across centuries. The story of a system that rewards the visible and quietly starves the essential. What made Emily's story different, she had come to believe, was not that she had finally been recognized, Recognition on its own changed nothing beyond the boundaries of one career. What made her story different was that the recognition had been followed by something rarer and far more valuable: structural change, a policy built into doctrine, a review process that could no longer be circumvented by a single dismissive commanding officer, a training program designed explicitly to ensure the next Emily Carter would never have to wait 11 years and a hostage crisis before anyone thought to ask what she'd been quietly building. That, she had come to understand, was the actual measure of whether a lesson had been learned. Not whether one story ended well, whether the system that produced that story became incapable of producing it again. Pollard, listening to this reflection one evening, months after the anniversary gathering, offered a thought that stayed with Emily longer than almost anything else said to her that year. "You know what the old military historians always talk about when they study turning points in warfare," he said. "It's never really the weapon. Everyone remembers the weapon, the rifle, the tactic, the single decisive maneuver that won the battle. But if you actually read the history closely, the weapon was almost always available long before anyone used it decisively. What actually changes the outcome of a war isn't the invention of something new. It's the moment someone finally has the courage to trust something that already existed but had been dismissed, ignored, or misunderstood by everyone who came before." Emily turned this thought over slowly, recognizing something true in it that reached far beyond her own experience. The thermal cycle patterns she had identified in that valley had not been created by her. They had always existed, embedded in the physics of wind and heat and terrain, waiting patiently for someone disciplined enough to notice them. Her genius, if that word even applied, had never been invention. It had been attention. The willingness to watch something long enough, carefully enough, humbly enough, to see a pattern that 13 talented people, moving too fast and trusting too quickly in what they already believed, had missed entirely. This, she began to understand, was the real inheritance she wanted to leave behind. Not a single impossible shot that would be remembered and eventually forgotten the way all impressive feats eventually are, but a discipline of attention, a culture built around the radical, almost countercultural idea that the most important insights rarely announce themselves loudly. They arrive quietly, earned through years of unglamorous observation, and they belong, more often than institutions like to admit, to the people standing in the back of the room, not the people standing at the front of it. There was a kind of moral clarity in this that Emily found herself returning to again and again as her program continued to grow, a clarity that extended far beyond the narrow world of long-range marksmanship. Every institution, she had come to believe, military or otherwise, carried some version of the same blind spot, some tendency to mistake confidence for competence, volume for value, visibility for worth. And every institution, if it wanted to survive its own blind spots, needed to build deliberate structures, forcing it to look past the loudest voices in the room toward the quieter ones that might be holding the actual answer. She thought often of the exact phrase Briggs had used in that command center on the worst night of her career, the question that had, against every reasonable expectation, finally found her. Any snipers left? It was such a small question. 4 ordinary words, asked out of desperation rather than wisdom. Briggs had not asked it because he believed the answer was sitting quietly nearby. He had asked it because he had run out of options, because 13 failures had stripped away every alternative except the one nobody had considered. And that, Emily had come to believe, was perhaps the most important and most uncomfortable truth buried inside her entire story. Crisis had been the only thing capable of forcing that question to finally be asked. Left to its ordinary rhythms, the institution she served would likely never have asked it at all. It had taken 31 lives hanging in the balance, 13 decorated failures, and a general with nothing left to lose, before anyone thought to look toward the woman who had been sitting there ready for the entirety of her 14 months in that unit, and arguably for the entirety of her career before that. She did not want the next great insight buried in her Army's ranks to require a hostage crisis before someone finally thought to ask the right question. That was the entire purpose behind the Carter Standard, behind the mandatory review policy, behind every hour she now spent building a system deliberately designed to notice quiet excellence before circumstance forced the issue. History, she had come to believe, was full of near misses in the opposite direction, moments when the crisis arrived and the quiet expert in the corner never got asked at all, when the notebook stayed closed, when the pattern went unnoticed until it was too late for anyone to benefit from it. Nobody wrote songs about those failures, because by definition, nobody ever discovered what might have been possible. The tragedy of a genius who has never asked the right question does not announce itself the way a triumph does. It simply disappears, quietly, into administrative postings and rejected research papers and careers that end in obscurity, and the world never learns what it lost. This, more than the shot itself, more than the vindication of the hearing, more than the training program bearing her name, was the true weight Emily now carried forward into every soldier she trained, every lecture she gave, every notebook she encouraged young recruits to keep, even when nobody around them seemed interested in reading it. Because somewhere in every generation, in every institution, in every command structure ever built by people trying their honest best to identify talent and reward competence, there would always be another version of Emily Carter, sitting quietly in the corner of some room, filling pages nobody had yet thought to open, waiting patiently for a crisis that history would either force someone to notice her in time, or, just as easily, might never come at all. The measure of a truly great institution, she had come to believe, was not whether it eventually recognized its own Emily Carter after the crisis had already nearly cost everything. The measure was whether it built the discipline, the humility, and the structural courage to ask the right question long before any crisis ever arrived to force the issue. That was the standard she now held herself and everyone she trained to, not the standard of surviving one impossible night in a mountain valley, but the far higher, far quieter standard of building a world where nobody capable ever again has to wait 11 years in silence for someone, anyone, to finally think to ask. And so the story of the impossible shot became something larger than the shot itself, larger than the general who asked the question, larger even than the woman who finally answered it. It became a permanent reminder, carried forward through every soldier who would ever train under her name, that greatness rarely shouts. It waits. It watches. It fills its notebooks in silence, year after year, refusing to disappear even when nobody is looking, because somewhere deep inside every overlooked talent lives the quiet, unshakable conviction that the truth does not require an audience to remain true. It only requires someone, someday, to finally ask.